So, as usual, very good questions. The most popular one, by far the most popular one, is there a difference between how women and men approach conflict in individualistic versus collective cultures? The answer to that question is yes. This is something Stella Ting Toomey, who I talked about 2 weeks ago with her model of intercultural competence, and last week with face negotiation theory. She published a study on this a long time ago, 1991, but it was on this question. I've often seen her draw a chart that looks like this. If you imagine the extreme of interdependence and the extreme of independence. So this is the most independent person on earth. That's the most interdependent person on earth. She says, the United States, the range goes about like that. And Japan, it goes about like that. So the most independent person in Japan is more independent than the most interdependent person in the United States. There is an overlap in the middle. But the most independent person in the United States is way more independent than the most you'll find in Japan. Now, we might consider, crudely, not precisely, in the United States, most men are here, most women are here. There may be some feminine men here, some masculine women here. But women tend to adopt conflict strategies more characteristic of interdependent self-construal, more smoothing, more avoiding, more giving in. Men tend to adopt conflict strategies more consistent with independent self-construal, more dominating, more fighting. Here, same thing. Men will be here, women will be here on the whole. Some women may be here, some men may be here, but the trend is that direction. In her 1991 study, she said, there's no cultural interaction. What the cultures you look at do not affect that distribution much. Whatever the overall arrangement of the culture, men will be in the direction of more independent, women in the direction of more interdependent with the associated conflict behaviors. Very good question. Second question. Is it actual solutions when they forgive people who did bad things? Because it's too kind. What I want to do in answering this question is I want to explain a little bit why the teachings of Christianity emphasize so much that you forgive people no matter what. Because I have encountered again and again here at Suda and at Gaidai, very reasonably, people saying, why should I forgive someone who does something horrible? That doesn't make sense. Well, there are 3 ideas behind it. First of all, what if someone stole your money? They just took your money, and now you can't have lunch because your pockets are empty. That would be pretty bad, and you might be angry. What if you found out they stole your money because their baby had not eaten in 3 days and was no longer crying from hunger because the baby was too weak, and they stole your money to buy formula for their baby? If that happened to me, my compassion would take over. I would forgive them immediately. So the first factor is compassion. Now, I gave an extreme example, but something that happens or should happen. I talked at the first class meeting about how Christians mature. And as they mature in their faith, what it takes for them to feel compassion, it gets lower and lower. The threshold gets lower and lower. If someone were to take my money, I would think, I feel sad that money is so important to you that you think you'll get security from it, or you think you'll get value or an identity from money. I don't feel that way. So if you need to take my money, okay. You can ask my colleagues over at Suda. I leave my office unlocked all the time. Because if someone needs to take something of mine, I wish they didn't have that need, but forgiving them is going to be pretty easy because I feel sad that that seemed necessary to them. Now, there is a flaw in this reasoning that some of you are thinking about right now. What if you knew every single fact, detail going on in their life, and there was nothing that should make you feel compassionate? They just did something bad because they are a nasty, mean, hateful person. I think possibly that could happen. And one thing that I didn't talk about in the first class meeting here, I did it when I've taught the class elsewhere. God knows things and we know things, but we know things imperfectly. We know things incompletely and we are sometimes wrong. God knows things perfectly. His knowledge is perfect and it is complete. And the Bible never says, don't try to know things because God does it better. We love, and you saw me about 3 class meetings ago talk about how sometimes we pervert love. And we use the idea of love to manipulate, or we love in a way that's hurtful or wrong. God loves perfectly, and the Bible never says, don't try to love because God is better at it than you. I am setting up my point. The Bible does say, don't take revenge when people do evil things, because God is going to, and He's better at it than you. One Christian teaching is that God has wrath. Wrath is an English word that doesn't get used that often. It overlaps with the word anger. It is more intense. It is more violent. Wrath is almost always aimed at a behavior, and wrath includes acting to stop, to even destroy that behavior. When human beings have wrath, often it looks like throwing a tantrum. It looks like screaming. It looks like violent physical attack to hurt someone. The Bible says God has wrath against sin. But we've already made the point today. God has knowledge and it's perfect. God has love and it's perfect. Our knowledge, our love don't look like God's love. If you've ever heard about God's wrath, one thing I want you to understand, God's wrath does not look like human wrath. Human wrath is sometimes mistaken. We sometimes get angry and later realize we misunderstood. That doesn't happen to God. Human wrath is violence because we think we might not have enough power, so we have to use all our power to stop this thing that we hate. But God has all power. His wrath is precise. It is surgical. It is exactly what the wrongdoer deserves and what the Bible teaches. Every human being will someday come face to face with God with no separation. It will happen at the end of your life. It will happen when the world ends. And when that happens, God invited you while you were alive, teaches Christianity. The Christian teaching is God invited you to accept the free gift that Jesus paid the penalty for wrongdoing and disobedience, so you are spared God's wrath. And for everyone who accepted that invitation, when you come face to face with God, you are God's child, and that's the end of it. And for everyone who did not, God's wrath, surgical and precise, will be directed against your disobedience. And the Bible teaches in a couple of kind of obscure passages, his wrath will be so perfect, even the people receiving it will admit that it was fair. And that everyone else, everyone watching as God judges his creation, will sing for joy over how beautiful, because his wrath is not an explosion or a tantrum. It's precise and it's perfect. So one of the reasons it's easy for me to forgive people, either there's a reason for me to have compassion for them, there's something going on in their life, and if I knew it, I would forgive them. That's one possibility. The other possibility is there's nothing that would make me forgive them. In that case, God is going to handle it perfectly. And if I try to handle it, I will mess it up. Better to leave it to what will be so precise that it will be beautiful. One last factor in explaining forgiveness in Christianity is what I would say, I'd call it confidence. Let us say someone stole 1,000 yen from you, and it's your last 1,000 yen, and you might be going hungry tonight. That would be upsetting. What if someone stole 1,000 yen from you and you are a billionaire? Would you care? When people do things to me that are upsetting, the one other example before I get to that, sometimes people don't steal from you, they cause you pain. But sometimes you can put that pain in perspective. I have two examples. Some of you in here may someday become moms or dads. Your child will learn how to walk. When they are learning how to walk, they are sometimes clumsy. For the men in particular, they will step somewhere you don't want them to step. It will hurt. You will forgive them. They didn't mean to. They will grow into teenagers. They will know what to say to you that really hurts. They'll be that intelligent, they won't be wise enough to know they shouldn't do it. And you'll forgive them. You forgive the toddler because you love them and you know they didn't mean to. You forgive the teenager because you love them even though they really did hurt you, because you know they're growing into someone who won't do that. So what I would say, as far as confidence, I would say I get my identity from my Creator, from my Heavenly Father who forgave me. I get what it takes for me, like the money I need, the roof over my head. I trust that I'm going to be provided for. If someone takes my stuff, there's more stuff out there. And if someone causes me pain, I have been loved when I didn't deserve it, and so I owe to love people who don't deserve it. If I hold back forgiveness thinking they don't deserve it, the thought I should immediately have is, well, I'm glad Jesus didn't think that. Because when he was on the cross and he looked down, he didn't say, oh, they all deserve it. He was looking at a lot of people who didn't. That was a long answer, but it's something that's come up a bunch of times. So, question 3. If there was a limit to forgiving a sin, what do you think would be unforgivable? I tried to come up with a good answer to this, and this is the best I could do. It's a little bit like saying, if there were a highest number, what do you think that number would be? There's not a highest number. That's not how numbers work. And you could say a billion, cajillion, cajillion, but you can always add 1 to that and 1 to that, so there is no highest number. I could take this question and say, I don't know, taking a newborn puppy and jumping up and down on it. I could make something up that, I know, that was meant to be awful. I could make something up that was gruesome. But the fact of the matter is, because God is better at loving than we are, the Christian teaching is, if someone from the heart repents, if they are brokenhearted over their sin and there has been a change, if they have turned from what they intended, then he could forgive anything. One other thing I'd say about this, if we went around and had everybody name the worst possible sin, we wouldn't get one answer. We'd get lots of answers. For some people, the worst possible sin would be physical violence that took a life. For others, it would probably be some variety of sexual assault. For others, it would be some variety of theft. Whatever it is that really matters to you, you'll name the worst violation of that as the worst possible crime. And God has a perspective on what matters and what doesn't that no human being has. So I can't think of an answer that would really get at this. All right. 4th question. When is dominating or smoothing over better than problem solving? I have a few answers to this. Let me take dominating first. I have a niece, my older brother's daughter. She's 27. She's a school teacher with special education and emotionally disturbed children. They sometimes lose control. And one of the things she's trained to do is grab them in a big bear hug. Now, she doesn't hit them. She doesn't cause them pain, but it's to let them calm down. And it's dominating. It's physical force to stop them. There are also adults and even children who are psychopaths, who have a configuration in their brain. They don't feel empathy. They don't understand right or wrong. There's a school in the United States with a good record of teaching children who are psychopaths. The name of the school is Mendota Today. It's in, if I remember right, Minnesota. No, it's the Today Tomorrow program. And it tries to teach the children, when you behave this way, you get rewards. When you behave this way, you get punishments. It teaches them to do with their brain, with their thinking and their reasoning, what everybody else does with empathy and a conscience. But there are lots of punishments. And it's perfectly appropriate because nothing else works. I had one other example. No, I didn't. Smoothing over. When is smoothing over better? I would say smoothing over is appropriate temporarily when the right moment hasn't arrived. If you have a conflict that you need to address, but someone has just suffered a crippling loss, family members have been killed, or they've just been laid off from their job, you might temporarily deal with a situation that the two of you need to talk about, temporarily smooth it over, and wait for the right moment to talk directly. So the model of communication competence says, observe that moment, that encounter, and use the tool you have that is the best tool available. And sometimes smoothing over temporarily is better, and sometimes dominating works because they can't have a conversation with you because of flaws in their reasoning. All right. Forgiving someone can sometimes be very stressful for you. Is it important to forgive someone even if it causes you pain? Why or why not? This question was so good, it gave birth to new extra credit, and I'm not making that up. First of all, I question the premise that not forgiving someone will protect you from pain. If someone does something that hurts you, and you carry the anger and the unforgiveness with you, that'll cause its own pain. Thursday of last week, in a magazine that I read every morning, The Atlantic, they published an article, What It Means to Forgive the Unforgivable. And I posted it in Moodle. It will become visible at the end of class today. It's just 3 pages long. It is the story of 2 Christians. One of them is a murderer, a true story, not fiction. One is a murderer on death row who's supposed to be put to death this month. The other is the granddaughter of the woman he murdered. And it's the story of how she hated him, but then forgave him. And it speaks directly to this question, because she forgave him because her unforgiveness had done nothing but build up her pain. And when she did forgive, what happened next is what the story is about. The extra credit. If you will read the story, just 3 pages, send me an email with a summary of it. I will replace 10 with 100 after May 16th. So the song extra credit was only May 16th and before. The What It Means to Forgive the Unforgivable. I think if you read it, you'll see it nails this question. So, that's available to you. One other thing I want to say in answer to this, and then I think I'm out of time for fielding questions. Very often, people I've known who are atheists or agnostics who talk with me about Christian teaching, they'll say, well, why doesn't God just forgive? What's the whole thing with Jesus on the cross? Why can't God just say, I forgive you? He's all-powerful. But this question has in it the reason why. God hates sin. He hates wrongdoing so much. Forgiveness comes at a price. If someone destroys something that belongs to you, either you make them pay to replace it, or you pay to replace it, or you live without it. In each of those instances, either they pay or you pay, someone pays. And when people do not obey God and they bring disobedience into the world with everything that came with it, forgiveness is not free. And we can't necessarily understand the reasons why, teaches Christianity. We can't understand all the reasons why. But if we wanted to be restored in relationship to God, someone had to pay. And what Jesus did was the payment. That is what Christianity teaches. Now, today's new topic, I have a lot to say. We may be able to come back, and field a few more questions at the end. But this time, I'm not going to forget. I'm going to show you the trios and let you go introduce yourself to each other. That's the wrong week. This is this week. So, go meet your partners, and I will quickly take attendance. And we will resume in 5 minutes. So the recorder is back on, and today's new content, today's new topic, is the topic of power. And let me begin by defining what we mean by power. Power means if there's someone else you want to behave a certain way and they don't want to, but they do what you want them to do, then you have power. So, if, let's say, I want Shimizu-san to sit there. He didn't. I have no power. But if I said that and he moved, I would have, well, if you didn't want to, then I would have had power. Whenever someone does other than what they would have chosen on their own because of you, that is how broadly we define it. Now, there are a couple of sociologists who back in the 1950s, their names are French and Raven, they divided power into categories, and the categories have held up well. I see this used in all kinds of academic fields, including my own. There is first legitimate power. Legitimate power is given to a person through a system consisting of rules that are agreed upon in advance. You get power from a system made up of rules agreed upon in advance. When the current emperor dies or steps down, who will become the new emperor? It's okay if you don't know the name, but will they just go out to the sidewalk and say, anyone want to be emperor? No, there's an heir. There's a line of succession. The next person to be prime minister will be the one who wins the election. The elections have rules decided in advance. You might not like the person who wins the election, but if they got the most votes, they have legitimate power. You might sometimes take a class from Bob, who's not a very good teacher, and you talk to Fred, who is a good teacher that you like. And Fred might say, well, if I were teaching that class, I would do this and this and this. But it's Bob's class. The school assigned Bob to teach it. You signed up with Bob. Bob has legitimate power. Second category of power is expert power. That one needs a lot less explanation than legitimate. You have expert power if you know something or know how to do something that most people don't. If you have certain kinds of medical conditions, you need someone to perform surgery on you. Everyone who is a licensed and effective surgeon is an expert. You don't typically go pick someone off the street and say, would you perform surgery on me? Expertise is its own form of power. You can offer people your expertise. You can withhold your expertise to have leverage, to put pressure on people. Then there are two categories of power that go together. They're kind of the mirror image of one another. There is punishment power. Punishment power. When you were a small child, if you misbehaved, your parents, probably also your teachers, if you were on a team, possibly your coach, could punish misbehavior. The possibility of punishment meant that they were powerful. Police officers can pull you over if you are speeding or otherwise driving your car wrong. They can detain you. If you're walking around, they could arrest you and put you in jail. That potential gives them power. There's punishment that they can use to check your behavior. Now, someone tell me, what's the other one that's the mirror image? I bet you can guess it. What's the mirror image of punishment? Exactly. You show up to your job in most cases because every week or month they give you your pay. You show up to classes because if you do good work, you will get credit for the class, including a high grade. You come to college because you will get a diploma. The diploma will help you get a high-paying job. The ability to give rewards is a source of power. And I've always found the line between these to be blurry because your boss might pay you for your work. Your boss could lower your pay if you don't do a good job. So the reward and the punishment often almost bleed into one another. But that's me being too academic. There is information power. Originally, when French and Raven, when they talked about these categories, they left this one out because they said that this was really just expert power. Someone who has information that you don't have is an expert. But they later drew the distinction. Sometimes someone who's not an expert still has information you need. You might someday be the parent, once again, of a teenager. And you might not know what's wrong with your teenager. You might talk to their best friend who has that information. Sometimes people have information you need. They aren't necessarily experts. They're in the right place at the right time, and it makes them powerful. They know something you need to know. The last of the categories of power is the most effective one of all. And apart from legitimate, it's the one that needs the most explanation. Referent. A person has referent power for you if you admire them, you look up to them, and it is important to you that you be faithful to what they expect. If disappointing them would be painful, they have referent power. They may not even be alive. You might just want to do things that you know would make them proud. And if that's true, they have referent power. I called this the most effective one because the exercise of most of these other kinds of power, especially punishment, can be very, very unpleasant. And often punishment just teaches you not to get caught. Referent power, on the other hand, we tend to enjoy it. We tend to feel that it's a good thing to know that if I change my behavior and strive really hard, this person that I admire, older sibling, parent, grandparent, your hero, whoever it is, they'll be proud of you. And you'll earn that. And that feels better than having your behavior changed by punishment. Why am I talking about all of this in this class? Because a bunch of places in a lot of academic disciplines, the point is made. Legitimate power in Japan is huge. It is very, very effective. It is almost the way things are. It's expected. In the United States and more broadly in the West, legitimate power is almost dead. Trust in institutions has fallen so low. I mentioned before elections as an example. The most recent presidential election in the United States, half the country believes wrongly that it was stolen. So, legitimate power in the United States is in a bit of a disaster area. In about 3 more weeks, we're going to talk about populism, about the political developments that have done that. And not just in the United States, there's a populist wave that has swept the whole developed world. There's even a mild version of it in Japan. But we're not going to get there yet. That's the future. The way we use this to understand cultural difference, this is the last time I'm going to put his face on the screen, Kurt Hofstede. He told us about individual and collective. He told us about direct and indirect, high and low uncertainty avoidance. And he also categorized cultures according to power distance. Power distance. Let me define that for you. A high power distance culture circulates the idea some people are more powerful, some people are less powerful, and that's okay. It's how things should be. Let's just accept it and let's talk openly about it. Some people are more powerful, some are less, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's high power distance. Low power distance cultures say, really, everybody ought to be equal. And I try not to say disrespectful things about cultural difference, but when I talk about this one, I can never resist. People are never equal. Anywhere there are humans, there's higher power and lower power. In low power distance cultures, they are uncomfortable admitting it and uncomfortable talking about it. I'm reminded of cultures around the world where you don't talk about death, and on the other hand, cultures like Mexico where they have holidays like Dia de los Muertos. Let's go have a picnic in the cemetery and decorate with skeletons because death is inevitable. Let's just talk about it. High power distance cultures, they say big differences in power we will talk openly about. Now, very high power distance, they sometimes go so far as to say, we celebrate it, we approve of it, it should be this way. I don't know that's always true, but the low power distance cultures, when they say we should all be equal and they don't like to talk about differences in power, a few times this semester I have pointed out that Australia is on one of the endpoints of one of these. Where do you think Australia is, high or low?
Low.
It's one of the lowest there is in power distance. It is a common practice, I'm told, I've never been to Australia, to talk about the Prime Minister and refer to them by their first name. Now that's unusual. Go for it.
When I was in high school, the Prime Minister of Australia came to my high school,
Oh, man.
and we all addressed him as Kevin, his first name.
Mhm.
We played handball with him,
Right.
and all the kids made like a video making fun of him basically, and he was just like a good laugh about it.
That's it. I have also heard, you can tell me if this is right, if something really wonderful happens to you in Australia, you win a Rhodes Scholarship to go study at Oxford, you don't mention it. Because if you mention it, you're making yourself out to be a big deal, and people will begin making fun of you until you shut up. May not happen everywhere, but that is reported sometimes, and that's a behavior that happens in a low power distance culture. Now, having introduced the concept, Japan is moderately high, the United States is moderately low. They're not at opposite ends. Let me tell you the details that keep Japan from being very high. First of all, decision by consensus. The fact that in a lot of organizations, everybody needs to agree, common practice in Japan. In a high power distance, a very high power distance culture, that would not happen. The one most powerful person in the organization would just decide. Some of the highest power distance cultures in the world are in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia has a true king, and what the king says goes, and there is no decision by consensus. The other thing that happens in Japan, you can change your status. You can move up. Now, that wasn't always true. Statuses were frozen in place for parts of Japan's history. But today, if you work very hard, you can gain wealth, you can be promoted, and you can wind up with more power than you started out life with. In the very high power distance cultures, you can't. The powerful people are born powerful, the powerless people are born powerless, and it stays that way. The United States probably would be regarded as a much lower power distance culture, except for the really, really ridiculous gap between the wealthiest and the poorest. We have one of the worst, or largest, won't say worst, largest gaps in the world between how much money the wealthiest have and what the poorest segment of the population live on. And in a true low power distance culture, that would not be tolerated. It definitely would not be celebrated. Okay, with that concept out there on the table, let me point out a few things about low power distance cultures, because I think I probably have a fair number of people in the room who've lived in a high power distance culture most of your life. This is my boss, or was until recently. He's the vice president of my university in the United States for academic affairs. He's the dean of the entire faculty, the dean over the other deans. Do you know, when I talk to him, what I call him? What do you think? Of the names on the screen, which ones do you think I use if I see him in the hallway? That's it. It is a moderately low power distance culture. He retired recently, but for 15 years I called him Dennis. He was replaced. That's my new boss. This is an easy question now. What do you think I call him? He reports directly to the president of the university, Dr. Joseph Womack, and we all call him Joe. One thing that happens in low power distance cultures, there's lots of informality. Titles are very unusual. At the first class meeting in here, I told you I wanted you to call me Doyo, which is my first name. All my students in the United States call me by my first name. And that's true for most of my colleagues. When people from high power distance cultures move to a low power distance culture and enroll their children in school, it often causes a huge mess because the children come home from school and address their parents in ways that seem really unacceptably disrespectful. In low power distance cultures, parents tend to give reasons or explanations when they correct children. They let children make a lot of their own choices. Another nation that's very low power distance is Sweden. And in Sweden, it is illegal to spank children. You can go to jail for it. On the other hand, France is moderately high power distance. And I've had a few friends visit France, stay in someone's home, and be very surprised how the parents talk to the children. They give them orders, almost like a commander in the military. And in the United States, parents will be preparing breakfast for the children and say, "What would you like to eat?" And the child will choose something. In higher power distance cultures, the parent comes to the table with the food, and there it is, take it or leave it. There are fewer decisions where the child's choice is even solicited. It somewhat follows individualism and collectivism, but it does not follow it perfectly. I just mentioned France. France is very individualistic, but also moderately high power distance. A little bit to come out of the research that is specific to Japan. A 2018 study by a team, Taoka and Kagohashi from Tokyo Tech. They had participants from Europe and participants from Japan, and the task they were given was to discuss a design project. They were going to design a park, a city park for their community, and one person sitting in the room was a designer. What the European participants did, they discussed what they would like, and occasionally they asked questions of the designer. They said, "Would this work?" The Japanese participants wouldn't talk to each other because there's a designer here. The designer should just decide. A 2019 study, it compared senpai-kohai relationships in schools across China, Korea, and Japan. And it found that in China, the senpai-kohai relationship was about support. Who do you turn to for support? In Korea, it was about who can you trust and how do you know what words it's polite to use. But in Japan, senpai and kohai was about authority and it was about obedience. And then finally, I've said a few times there were moments that inspired me that this class could work. One of them was finding a study a while back, 1993, but the researcher was Motoko Nagao of Takushoku University. The article was entitled Assertiveness Competence, and we talked about assertiveness last week. And the researcher was explaining why is it that it's so much more difficult for Japanese people to practice assertiveness than people in the United States. And she developed a model with 4 parts. the fourth part was the one that interested me the most. She said, Japanese culture at its foundation, the tradition of how you think of authority is Confucian. Good order, and you respect the ones who are above you in the hierarchy. But Americans grow up with Jesus and with Jesus' disciples. And Jesus argued with the religious leaders and didn't obey them. And after he sent his disciples out, they argued even more and refused to obey the leadership. And she said that's one of the key pressure points that explains why you either grow up thinking assertiveness makes people uncomfortable and makes problems, or you think assertiveness is how you bring about right outcomes in the world. With that in mind, let me take you to the applications that come out of Christianity that I think influence the difference. Today there's kind of a lot. So I've organized them. What Jesus taught, what Jesus did, what Jesus commanded, and what his followers did. So, first of all, what Jesus taught. Let me pop out of here, and you're going to hear his words. Right there. Boom. As soon as I make sure the sound is turned up. That probably would have been okay, but that ought to do it. And this is 6:20.
Yes, は目を上げて弟子たちを見つめながら話し始められた。貧しい人たちは幸いです。神の国はあなた方のものだからです。今飢えている人たちは幸いです。あなた方は満ち足りるようになるからです。今泣いている人たちは幸いです。あなた方は笑うようになるからです。人々があなた方を憎むとき、人の子のゆえに排除し、罵り、あなた方の名を足ざまにけなすと、あなた方は幸いです。その日には踊り上がって喜びなさい。見なさい。天においてあなた方の報いは大きいのですから。彼らの先祖たちも預言者たちに同じことをしたのです。しかし、富んでいるあなた方は哀れです。あなた方は慰めをすでに受けているからです。今満腹しているあなた方は哀れです。あなた方は飢えるようになるからです。今笑っているあなた方は哀れです。あなた方は泣き悲しむようになるからです。人々が皆あなた方を褒めるとき、あなた方は哀れです。彼らの先祖たちも偽預言者たちに同じことをしたのです。
So, those of you who weep now, you will laugh later. Those of you poor now, you'll be rich later. Those of you who are slandered now, that's how your ancestors spoke of the prophets. But if you're praised now, that's how they spoke of the false prophets. Christians often talk about this passage of Jesus' teaching. They call it the upside-down kingdom. And if you think that all you have is right now, that the past is past and you can't change it, the future is beyond your control, then what Jesus describes people having now is what it makes sense to have. Laughter, the specific word that's used there, refers to how you laugh when you triumph over your enemies. Being rich, being popular, being successful. If all you have is right now, that's what you ought to put all your effort into. I suspect it's what you're going to college to try to get. But a couple of things are true. First of all, every one of those things, power, money, popularity, laughter, all of it can be taken away. all of it can be taken from you by an unexpected turn in your fortunes. All of it can be taken by a natural disaster. All of it, you will get to the end of your life and it will crumble. You won't have it anymore. And the other thing that's true, they're all very, very important if you are trying to be your own God and run your own life from your own resources and decisions. If, on the other hand, your worldview, what your beliefs tell you, is that God is guiding you, that God is providing what you need, then losing any of those things is not that big of a deal. I really don't care if I'm powerful, and I'm not really impressed by other people who are powerful, because my beliefs tell me that the one who is sending me and guiding me is more powerful than anyone who ever lived or could live, comically so. So that's the first thing, Jesus teaching about the upside-down kingdom. Second thing, what Jesus did. He did this the night that he was arrested, and it is sometimes misunderstood. His disciples all gathered, and they ate a meal together. As they were gathered, he did something very surprising. He took off the robe that he wore for the streets and was just in his undergarment like a servant. And he took water and he went to each of them and washed their feet. Now it's easy to think, oh, that was nice. That probably felt good. Probably like a little foot massage. How pleasant. Oh no. This would have been something extremely, extremely shocking. Because back then you walked everywhere you went and the streets were full of animal dung. Your feet were disgusting. The servant who had the duty to wash the feet of people coming in off the street was the most menial servant in the house. And here he, who had already told them who he was, where he had come from, and where he was going, that is what he did for all of them, and he taught them a lesson. Do you understand what I've done for you? If I've washed your feet, you should wash one another's feet. I've been cautioned a few times, don't talk in Japan about the Barakumin. And I don't intend to talk about today, but the fact of the existence of the Barakumin, I want to use that to say, Jesus effectively made himself Barakumin, because he put himself in the role of being the dirtiest in a period in history when being dirty made you the lowliest of all. So, what Jesus taught, what he did, then there is what he commanded. And when it comes to what he commanded, I have lost my place. No, there it is. I have two passages very quickly to share with you, his words. One of them talks about Gentiles, and Gentiles are people from other countries who did not live in Judea. So they were not followers of God. And this is what Jesus said about them.
そこでイエスは彼らを呼び寄せて言われた。あなた方も知っている通り、異邦人の支配者たちは人々に対して横柄に振る舞い、偉い人たちは人々の上に権力を振るっています。あなた方の間ではそうであってはなりません。あなた方の間で偉くなりたいと思う者は皆に仕える者になりなさい。あなた方の間で先頭に立ちたいと思う者は皆のしもべになりなさい。人の子が仕えられるためではなく仕えるために、また多くの人のための贖いの代価として自分の命を与えるために来たことを。人の子が仕えられるためではなく仕えるために、また多くの人のための贖いの代価として自分の命を与えるために来たことを同じようにしなさい。
Okay. That's what he said about Gentiles, people from other nations. Here's what he said about the religious leaders, their own teachers. This is, let's see, just a little bit later and a little bit longer. Come on. If this is the moment the Wi-Fi kicks out on me, I am going to be very disappointed. It's possible that's what's going to happen. I will tell you, just in case this does not catch up with us, he talked about how the religious teachers, they loved to have the place of honor. They loved to, it's going to run on its own now. It heard me. So let me do this. Boom.
第23章。その時、イエスは群衆と弟子たちに語られた。立法学者たちやパリサイ人たちはモーセの座についています。ですから、彼らがあなた方に言うことはすべて実行し、守りなさい。しかし、彼らの行いを真似てはいけません。彼らは言うだけで実行しないからです。また彼らは重くて追いきれない荷を束ねて人々の肩に乗せるが、それを動かすのに自分は指一本貸そうとしません。彼らがしている行いはすべて人に見せるためです。彼らは聖句を入れる小箱を大きくしたり、衣の房を長くしたりするのです。宴会では神座を、街道では定石を好み、広場で挨拶されること、人々から先生と呼ばれることが好きです。しかし、あなた方は先生と呼ばれてはいけません。あなた方の教師はただ一人で、あなた方は皆兄弟だからです。あなた方は地上で誰かを自分たちの父と呼んではいけません。あなた方の父はただ一人、天におられる父だけです。また、死と呼ばれてはいけません。あなた方の死はただ一人、キリストだけです。あなた方のうちで一番偉いものは皆に仕えるものになりなさい。誰でも自分を高くする者は低くされ、自分を低くする者は高くされます。
The one last bit before I draw a few conclusions. I'm not going to go back to the presentation, but the fourth was what his followers did. And I'm just going to play you 3 verses. 2 of his disciples, Peter and John, they were preaching in public about what Jesus had done. This is after he was crucified and had ascended. And they were arrested. And they were brought before the same leaders who had ordered Jesus put to death. And these leaders told them to stop preaching. And this is what they said.
そこで彼らは2人を呼んで、イエスの名によって語ることも教えることも一切してはならないと命じた。しかし、ペテロとヨハネは彼らに答えた。神に聞き従うよりも、あなた方に聞き従う方が、神の御前に正しいかどうか、判断してください。私たちは自分たちが見たことや聞いたことを話さないわけにはいきません。
So, we started today talking about French and Raven and the different kinds of power. And one final point I want to make about how power looks different. Actually, there was a detail I was going to put in before I get to this. My college back in the United States has a master's degree in leadership. They've even, talked about me teaching classes in it, which I don't want to. But if you look at what comes out of research in the West about leadership, a phrase you will hear and an idea that is taught over and over again is servant leadership. Servant leadership. That I would make the argument that is the dominant understanding of effective leadership, that the leader puts themselves at the bottom, and that the members who follow the leader are served by the leader. And most of them would say that image came from Jesus washing his disciples' feet. That is baked into the idea of effective leadership in the West. Here we have French and Raven. And what I want to say is, after what Jesus says about power, this is where we wind up. That in Christian teaching, power by punishment is what no longer operates when you interact with God. And the question that's been raised a lot, how are you supposed to stop people from doing bad things if they're forgiven? This is how. And this is the point I've tried to make a few times. Christians do what they're supposed to do because what motivates them is they know what will give God joy. They know what God expects of them, and that operates as referent power. Now, what I want to do is give you your 15 minutes to formulate your question, but it's only about 2:25. So what I want to do is I want to go back and field a few more questions. And then at 2:35, whoops, if I can get this thing to work properly, about 2:35, then we will switch gears. Okay, boom, 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 boom. Okay, how can anything be forgiven? Whoops, that's not showing. How can anything be forgiven? Doesn't that remove any reason to not sin? Here's my answer to that. After someone does something bad, whether it's stealing, whether it's murder, what you then want is you want justice, but you don't want revenge, I would hope. And if what you want is justice, you can't have justice until after you forgive. Because if you try to arrive at justice when you haven't forgiven, it will turn into revenge. There is such a thing as the just and appropriate punishment, but you have to be motivated by that, and you have to be able to think clearly. And any situation where you haven't forgiven, that is not what you'll try to arrive at. Next question. Isn't problem solving just another form of smoothing over? Because in the end, you need to give up something. This one, it's a good question, but it's an easy question. Because smoothing over is about minimizing, it's about not talking to the other person directly. Problem solving requires talking to the other person directly. That's the difference. When you know there's a problem and you can just make it go away by smoothing it over, then you don't have to talk about it. Solving it requires talking about it. Okay, what is the exact definition of forgiveness in Christianity, as the forgiveness might be a subjective thing? Now, last week we said you have to forgive from the heart. That's part of the definition. And I played Jesus' parable for you, and you heard it from his mouth. You've got to forgive from the heart, not just behavior. You have to change your feelings. And that article, What It Means to Forgive the Unforgivable, goes into detail about it. But I have two other real short passages, not long ones like before. There's a famous teaching in the Bible, very often read out loud at people's weddings, about love. It's just 4 verses long. I mean, there's more, but I'm just going to give you 4 verses.
すべてを信じ、すべてを望み、すべてを忍びます。
Now, one of the phrases in verse 5 is often translated into English as love keeps no record of wrongs. So when you love someone and they did something wrong, you don't hold a grudge. You don't keep a record of it. That's part of the definition of forgiveness. When the toddler steps where they shouldn't step, you don't hold it against them. You forgive it. The other one, very, very quickly, that is Jeremiah. There you are. Right there and right there.
見よ、その時代が来る。主の言葉。その時私はイスラエルの家、およびユダの家と新しい契約を結ぶ。その契約は私が彼らの先祖の手を取ってエジプトの地から導き出した日に彼らと結んだ契約のようではない。私は彼らの主であったのに、彼らは私の契約を破った。主の言葉。これらの日の後に、私がイスラエルの家と結ぶ契約はこうである。主の言葉。私は私の立法を彼らのただ中に置き、彼らの心にこれを書き記す。私は彼らの神となり、彼らは私の民となる。彼らはもはやそれぞれ隣人に、あるいはそれぞれ兄弟に、主を知れと言って教えることはない。彼らが皆、身分の低いものから高いものまで、私を知るようになるからだ。主の言葉。私が彼らの不義を許し、もはや彼らの罪を思い起こさないからだ。
There are two things I wanted you to get from that passage. I will forgive their iniquity and remember their sin no more. The definition of forgiveness, you don't remember it anymore. And then also, no longer will one teach another, they will all know me. Before Jesus came, Israel had to deal with God through the priest. After that, everyone dealt with God directly because everyone was invited to be forgiven, which I think is another one of the influences on today's topic and being low power distance. You don't go to a priest, you deal with God directly. On that note, your 15 minutes will take you right up to 2:48, so let me put the timer up and generate me some real good questions just like you have for the past 9 weeks. And ready, set, go. I just have to find the timer. There it is. Boom.